I'm Willow Reed, 26, female. I live in a small apartment above a flower shop, and the smell of clay and damp earth is almost always on my hands. I'm a ceramicist, and my studio is my sanctuary, a place where I can shape the chaos of the world into something beautiful and whole. My life has always been simple, a stark contrast to the one my mother and sister chase. But that simplicity was shattered the day my grandmother's will was read, revealing a betrayal so deep it threatened to break me entirely. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. My grandmother, Evelyn, was the anchor of my world, while my mother, Susan, was busy teaching my older sister, Jessica, how to climb the social ladder. Grandma Evelyn was teaching me how to find my center on a pottery wheel. She saw the artist in me when my mother just saw a mess. "Your hands are meant to create, Willow," she'd say, her own hands, wrinkled and wise, guiding mine on the spinning clay. "Never let anyone tell you that's not a worthy life." Our family dynamic was a well-oiled machine of dysfunction. My mother, a personal shopper for the city's elite, valued appearances above all else. Her mantra was dress for the job you want, not the one you have, and she applied it to every facet of life. Jessica, 3 years my senior, was the perfect product of this philosophy. As a marketing manager for a luxury fashion brand, she was sleek, polished, and successful in a way my mother could brag about at her country club luncheons. Jessica had the right car, the right apartment, the right fiancé. She was the sun in my mother's solar system, and I was the distant, dusty moon, a ceramicist, a potter. When I announced my career choice, my mother had sighed with the dramatic flair of a Shakespearean actress. "Well," she'd said, forcing a tight smile, "I suppose someone has to make the decorative bowls." Jessica had just smirked, patting my arm condescendingly. "Don't worry, Willow, I'll buy one for my office for charity." The only person who ever truly understood was Grandma Evelyn. Her home was a haven filled with the scent of lavender and old books, a place where my clay-stained clothes were a badge of honor. We spent countless hours in her sun-drenched garden, her talking and me listening, absorbing her wisdom like a dry sponge. She was a woman of quiet strength and surprising wealth, having built a successful textile business from the ground up with my late grandfather. She often spoke of the future, of her legacy. "Everything I have, I built with love and hard work." She told me one afternoon, just a few months before she passed. We were trimming her rose bushes. Her eyes, usually sparkling with life, held a flicker of concern. "It's important that it goes to someone who understands its value, not just the monetary value, but the value of the effort, the heart." She squeezed my hand, her grip surprisingly firm. "I've made sure you will be taken care of, Willow. You have nothing to worry about. I've made my intentions crystal clear." That promise was a beacon of light during the dark days after her sudden passing. The grief was a physical weight, a hollow ache in my chest that made it hard to breathe. My mother and sister's mourning felt performative. They wore the right black dresses, accepted condolences with practiced sorrow, and immediately began speculating about the inheritance in hushed, excited whispers. Grandma's portfolio is extensive. I overheard Jessica telling my mother in the kitchen during the wake. "The estate on the coast alone must be worth a fortune." My mother shushed her, not out of respect for the dead, but for fear of being overheard by the wrong people. I clung to my grandmother's promise like a life raft. She had seen me, she had valued me, she wouldn't let my mother and sister's materialistic world swallow me whole. Mr. David Harrison, her lawyer and a man I'd known since I was a child, called to schedule the reading of the will for the following week. He sounded kind but formal over the phone. Evelyn was very specific about her arrangements. He said, his voice gentle. I felt a sense of peace settle over me. My grandmother was a woman of her word. She had made sure. I was so naive. I walked into that lawyer's office believing in promises, completely unprepared for the fact that some promises are designed to be broken. I thought I was walking into my future, but I was actually walking straight into a meticulously planned betrayal. Mr. Harrison's office was exactly as I remembered it from the few times I'd visited with my grandmother. Walls lined with leather-bound books, the air thick with the scent of old paper and wood polish. It felt safe, a place of order and fairness. I sat on one side of a large mahogany desk, while my mother and Jessica sat together on the other, a united front of Chanel and quiet confidence. Jessica kept checking her reflection in her phone's dark screen, while my mother sat ramrod straight, her purse clasped tightly in her lap. Mr. Harrison entered, his expression somber. He was a kind man with gentle eyes, and he gave me a small, sympathetic nod before taking his seat. "Thank you all for coming," he began, opening a thick folder on his desk. "Evelyn was a dear friend and a valued client for over 40 years. Her loss is deeply felt." My mother produced a delicate sniffle, dabbing a pristine handkerchief at the corner of her eye. Jessica reached over and patted her hand in a gesture that looked rehearsed. As the executor of her estate, Mr. Harrison continued, "It is my duty to read her last will and testament." He cleared his throat and put on a pair of reading glasses. "Let's begin." He read through the initial legal jargon, the formal language a low hum in the quiet room. My heart was pounding. This was it. This was the moment my grandmother's promise would be fulfilled. "First, to my beloved daughter, Susan, Mr. Harrison read," and my mother leaned forward slightly. "I leave my collection of antique jewelry with the hope that she will wear it in good health and remember the happy times we shared." My mother's smile was tight. She had expected more, but this was just the beginning. The jewelry was valuable, a small fortune in itself. Next, Mr. Harrison paused, and the air in the room grew heavy. This was the main part of the estate. The properties, the investments, the business assets, the legacy. He looked up from the paper, his gaze briefly meeting mine before flicking away. "To my eldest granddaughter, Jessica, I bequeath the remainder of my estate. This includes all properties, real and personal, all stocks, bonds, and financial accounts, and all assets associated with my former business, Evelyn Textiles." The words hit me like a physical blow. I couldn't breathe. The remainder, that meant everything, the house on the coast, the apartment in the city, the savings, the investments, everything. I stared at Mr. Harrison, waiting for him to continue, waiting for the part about me. But he just kept reading the details of the transfer to Jessica. Jessica's face was a mask of feigned surprise, her eyes wide. "Oh my," she whispered, turning to our mother. I don't know what to say." My mother, however, dropped her sorrowful act instantly. A look of pure, unadulterated triumph spread across her face. She squeezed Jessica's hand, her knuckles white. They had won. I felt my own hands begin to shake. What about me? The question came out as a strangled whisper. I looked at Mr. Harrison, my eyes pleading with him. He avoided my gaze, his own expression unreadable as he scanned the document. "Ah, yes," he said, his voice flat. He seemed to be reading from a small, final clause. "To my youngest granddaughter, Willow Reed." He paused, and for a heart-stopping second I thought there was a mistake, a correction coming. "I leave my first pottery wheel, which is currently in storage in the garage. May it bring you as much joy in creation as it once brought me." A pottery wheel, an old dusty pottery wheel, that was it. The room started to spin, all those conversations, all those promises. They meant nothing. It was a joke, a cruel, sick joke. I could feel the hot sting of tears behind my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I would not give my mother and sister the satisfaction. Jessica finally broke the silence. "Well, that's nice," she said, her voice dripping with pity. "You always loved your crafts, Willow. Grandma knew you best." My mother nodded in agreement. "It's a sentimental gift, dear, the most precious kind, far more valuable than money." The hypocrisy was so thick I could have choked on it. They were sitting on a mountain of cash and assets, telling me that an old piece of equipment was the real treasure. I stood up, my chair scraping harshly against the wooden floor. I couldn't stay in that room for another second. "Excuse me," I mumbled, turning towards the door. "Willow, wait," Mr. Harrison said, a strange note of urgency in his voice. But I didn't stop. I couldn't look at him. I couldn't look at any of them. I stumbled out of the office and into the sterile hallway, the sound of my mother's triumphant sigh echoing in my ears. The betrayal wasn't just about the money. It was about the lie. My grandmother, the one person I thought had my back, had sided with them in the end. She had validated their belief that I was worth less. As I walked out into the cold, unforgiving city, I felt utterly and completely alone. The foundation of my world had crumbled, leaving nothing but dust and the bitter taste of a broken promise. The weight of it all was crushing me. The days that followed the will reading were a blur of gray. Grief for my grandmother became tangled with the sharp, raw pain of her betrayal. I couldn't bring myself to go to my studio. The clay felt foreign in my hands, and the silence of the room, once a comfort, now felt suffocating. My mother called once, her voice bright and cheerful, to talk about Jessica's plans to sell the coastal estate. "The realtor thinks she can get a record price for it," she chirped, completely oblivious or perhaps indifferent to my pain. I ended the call quickly. About a week later, a delivery truck rumbled to a stop outside my apartment. Two men grunted and heaved as they carried a large, tarp-covered object up the stairs. It was the pottery wheel. My inheritance. They set it down in the middle of my small living room, where it sat like a monument to my humiliation. It was an old model, heavy and cast iron, coated in a thick layer of dust and dried clay splatters from decades past. My first instinct was to get rid of it, to call a scrap yard and have them haul it away, but I couldn't. It was the last thing she had given me. For 2 days, I ignored it, walking around it as if it were a bomb. But on the third day, something shifted. I decided I would clean it, not to use it, but as a final act of saying goodbye. If I was going to get rid of it, I wanted to do so with some dignity, to honor the memory of the woman I thought I knew. I dragged the heavy thing into my studio space, the iron legs scraping against the floor. I filled a bucket with warm water and soap, found some old rags, and got to work. As I scrubbed away the layers of dust and time, I felt a strange sense of connection. I could almost see my grandmother's hands on the wheel head, her foot on the pedal. This wheel had shaped thousands of pots, bowls, and vases. It had been a part of her creative soul. I worked meticulously, cleaning every crevice. The wheel had a thick wooden frame around the base, which seemed odd for such a heavy-duty piece of equipment. As I ran my cloth along the underside of the splash pan, my fingers brushed against a section of the wood that felt loose. Curiosity piqued, I pushed on it gently. There was a faint click. A small, rectangular piece of the wooden frame popped open, revealing a hidden compartment no bigger than a shoebox. My heart started to hammer against my ribs. What was this? I reached inside, my fingers closing around something small and cold. I pulled it out. It was a small, ornate, old-fashioned skeleton key, the kind you might find for a jewelry box or a diary. Tucked beside it was a folded piece of stationery, yellowed with age. My hands trembled as I carefully unfolded it. It was my grandmother's handwriting, elegant and familiar. The note was short, just a few lines. My dearest Willow, if you are reading this, it means you found my first gift. I know you must be hurt and confused, and for that I am truly sorry. Things are not as they seem. Your mother and sister see the world in dollars and cents, but I know you see it in truth and beauty. The world of money has sharp edges, and I had to protect you from them in a way you wouldn't expect. This key opens a door, but not a literal one. Go to the place where my heart will always be, the one I built with your grandfather. The answer is in box 713. Trust Mr. Harrison. He knows the final move, but you must make the first one. All my love, Grandma Evelyn. I read the note 3 times, the words blurring through my tears. These weren't tears of sadness, but of overwhelming relief and a dawning, fierce sense of hope. She hadn't betrayed me. This was a plan, a puzzle, a crack in the facade. I whispered to myself, the words from her note echoing in my mind. Things are not as they seem. The place she built with my grandfather. Their first business, Evelyn Textiles, had been headquartered in the old City Commerce Bank building downtown before she sold the company years ago. The bank still operated there, box 713, a safe deposit box. My grandmother had left me a treasure map. A fire I thought had been extinguished roared back to life inside me. The fog of grief and despair began to lift, replaced by a sharp, clear sense of purpose. This wasn't an inheritance, it was a mission. My grandmother had trusted me, her true heir, to uncover the truth. She had known my mother and sister's greed would blind them. They were celebrating their victory, completely unaware that the game was not even close to being over. And I was holding the key that would change everything. My hands were steady now, no longer shaking with sorrow, but buzzing with the promise of justice. The next morning, I walked into the City Commerce Bank with the key clutched in my pocket. Its cold weight was a constant, tangible reminder of my mission. The bank was an imposing building with marble floors and high ceilings that made my footsteps echo. I approached a clerk, my heart pounding a nervous rhythm, and explained that I needed to access a safe deposit box left to me by my grandmother, Evelyn Reed. After verifying my identity and the key, a stern-faced manager led me down to the vault. The air grew cool and still as he unlocked the heavy, circular door. He led me to a wall of gleaming metal boxes and used his key, along with mine, to open box number 713. He slid out a long, thin metal container and placed it on a table in a private viewing room, leaving me alone with a quiet click of the door. For a moment, I just stared at the box. This was it, the answer my grandmother had promised. With a deep breath, I lifted the lid. Inside, there were no jewels, no cash, no bearer bonds. It was filled with no cash, no bearer bonds. It was filled with papers. On top lay a thick stack of letters, tied together with a simple silk ribbon. Each one was addressed to me in my grandmother's familiar script. I untied the ribbon and began to read. The letters were a chronicle of her final years, a diary of her thoughts she had never shared aloud. She wrote of her growing disappointment with my mother and Jessica. She detailed conversations where they had pressured her about her will, making thinly veiled suggestions about consolidating assets and protecting the family's primary heirs. Susan and Jessica see my life's work as a prize to be won, one letter read. They talk of liquidating, of selling, of turning everything into cash. They don't understand that the house on the coast is where your grandfather and I fell in love. They don't care that the business was built on relationships, not just profits. They see price tags, Willow, you see memories. Tears streamed down my face as I read, but this time they were for her. For the loneliness she must have felt, surrounded by people who saw her as a walking bank account. She wrote about her fears that if she left me a direct, substantial inheritance, my mother and sister would have found a way to contest it or manipulate me out of it. They would have painted me as the ungrateful child who didn't deserve it, while they were the responsible ones. So, she had devised a plan, a brilliant, painful plan. She would give them exactly what they wanted, knowing their greed would make them accept it without question. She would let them believe they had won. But she had created a failsafe. The last letter in the stack instructed me on what to do next. Mr. Harrison has the final piece of this puzzle, my love. He is a good man, bound by the law, and he could not act on this until you came to him with proof that you had found my trail. He holds a document, a binding codicil to my will. It contains a morality clause. Take these letters to him. He will know what to do. Show him you are your grandmother's granddaughter. Underneath the letters was another document, a copy of a deed. It was for a small commercial property on the outskirts of the city, the location of my very first tiny art studio that I had been renting for years. The deed had been transferred into a trust. My grandmother had bought the building for me over a year ago, placing it in a trust under a name I didn't recognize. She had become my silent, secret landlord. The trust was structured to transfer ownership to me on my 27th birthday, regardless of the will's outcome. She had made sure I would always have my sanctuary. Clutching the letters and the copy of the deed, I left the bank and went straight to Mr. Harrison's office. I didn't have an appointment, but when his secretary saw the look on my face, she showed me right in. He stood up as I entered, his expression shifting from surprise to something I could only describe as relief. I didn't say a word. I just walked to his desk and laid the letters and the key on the polished mahogany surface. He looked down at them, then back up at me, a slow, sad smile forming on his face. I was hoping you would find it, he said, his voice soft. Evelyn was a remarkable woman. Cunning, even, she knew her family. He picked up the key. She called this her honesty test. She believed only a person with a good heart, one not blinded by greed, would bother to clean an old pottery wheel. He then unlocked a drawer in his own desk and pulled out a sealed envelope. As per my instructions from Evelyn, I was to hold this codicil and remain silent until you presented me with that key. I am legally bound to execute it now. He broke the seal and slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. Read it, Willow. This is her true last wish. The paper was heavy, official, and as I read the carefully worded legal text, I finally understood the full scope of my grandmother's genius. This wasn't just a plan. It was a masterpiece of righteous revenge, and the final act was about to begin. The document Mr. Harrison showed me was a legally binding addendum to the will, a codicil drafted and signed just 6 months before my grandmother passed away. It was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its power. It contained a single, powerful morality clause. The clause stated that my grandmother's primary wish was for her family to remain united, and for her assets to be shared in a spirit of love and fairness. The will that was read aloud, the one that gave everything to Jessica, was intentionally designed as a test. If Jessica, as the sole inheritor, and Susan, as the primary influencer, did not offer to voluntarily and legally share the inheritance with me in a fair and equitable manner within 60 days of the will's reading, the morality clause would be triggered, and the consequence of failing this test was absolute. Upon activation of the clause, the entire will would be rendered null and void. Every asset, the houses, the stocks, the cash, the jewelry, would be immediately liquidated, and the total sum, minus legal fees, would be donated in its entirety to a list of charities my grandmother had selected, primarily arts education programs for underprivileged children. The only exception was the pre-existing, separate trust that held the deed to my studio building, which was legally untouchable and already mine in everything but name. They would be left with nothing. Not a single cent. Their greed would be the instrument of their own downfall. Your grandmother set a trap, Willow, Mr. Harrison explained, his eyes glinting with admiration for his late client. She gave them a chance to do the right thing. Their failure to do so is what gives this codicil its legal teeth. It's not about punishing them, it's about them failing to meet a condition of the inheritance. A slow smile spread across my face. It was poetic. My grandmother hadn't just disinherited them, she had made them disinherit themselves. Now, it was up to me to choose the moment to reveal it. I could have Mr. Harrison simply send them a legal notice, a cold and impersonal letter that would inform them of their monumental error. But that didn't feel right. They had humiliated me in a sterile, quiet office. They had gloated in private whispers. Their downfall needed to be witnessed. They needed to understand the depth of their miscalculation face to face. They needed to see what they had thrown away. The plan began to form in my mind, clear and sharp. Jessica had been sending me texts all week, filled with fake sympathy and not-so-subtle bragging. She was planning to put the coastal estate on the market next month and was having a designer come in to stage it for sale. It was her crown jewel, the ultimate symbol of her victory. That house, the place filled with my happiest childhood memories, would be the perfect stage for the final act. I called her that evening. I forced my voice to sound defeated, fragile. Jess, hi. I started, injecting a little tremor into my words. I know you're busy with everything, but I was wondering, before you sell Grandma's house, could we have one last family dinner there, just me, you, and Mom, to say goodbye to the place properly? There was a pause on the other end of the line. I could almost hear the gears turning in her head. A final dinner would be the ultimate power move for her. A chance to lord her new status as Lady of the Manor over me one last time, to watch me mourn the life I would never have. It was irresistible. Oh, Willow, she cooed, her voice oozing synthetic compassion, of course. I think that's a wonderful idea, a chance for closure for all of us. Great, I said, my voice barely a whisper. How about this Saturday? Perfect. Mom and I will be there anyway, meeting with the stagers. We'll bring dinner. Don't you worry about a thing. Thank you, Jess, I said, and hung up before she could hear the ice in my voice. The stage was set. The actors were in place, completely unaware of the script I now held. I contacted Mr. Harrison and told him my plan. He was to arrive at the house at 8 o'clock sharp. He agreed, a hint of excitement in his professional tone. Saturday would be the 60th day mark since the will was read. The deadline. They had spent 2 months celebrating their win, planning their lavish new lives, and pitying me for my dusty old pottery wheel. They had no idea that all this time the clock had been ticking, and it was about to strike midnight on their fantasy. I arrived at my grandmother's coastal house on Saturday evening just as the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The house stood on a bluff overlooking the ocean, a place that had always felt like magic to me. Now it felt like a courtroom. When I walked in, my mother and sister were already there, standing in the living room with 2 other people, the designers they had hired. They were pointing at walls and discussing color palettes. We'll get rid of all this heavy, dark wood, Jessica was saying, waving a dismissive hand at the carved mahogany bookcase my grandfather had built. Everything will be light and airy, coastal chic. My mother turned and saw me, her face breaking into a bright, brittle smile. Willow, darling, you're just in time. We were just planning the renovation. What do you think of a nice, clean white for this room? It's your house, Jessica. I said quietly, my voice even. You should do what you want with it. Her smile widened. My deference was exactly what she wanted. That's right, she said softly. After the designers left, the 3 of us sat down for dinner in the formal dining room. They had ordered from an expensive restaurant, and the table was laden with fancy dishes. They talked and laughed, discussing Jessica's plans to buy a new car, my mother's ideas for a trip to Europe. I barely spoke, just picking at my food, letting their words wash over me. My silence seemed to fuel their performance. They were so comfortable, so assured in their positions. You know, Willow, my mother said, placing her fork down and fixing me with a look of concern. Now that all of this is settled, you need to start thinking about your future. This pottery thing is a nice hobby, but it's not a career. Jessica and I would be happy to help you find something more stable. I'm fine, Mom, I said. She's right, Jessica chimed in, dabbing her lips with a napkin. I could probably get you an entry-level position in the mailroom at my company. It's not glamorous, but it's a start. You have to be realistic. The condescension was breathtaking. They were offering me scraps from their banquet table. I took a slow, deliberate sip of water, my gaze steady on their faces. I glanced at the grandfather clock in the corner. It was 7:58 p.m. Actually, I said, my voice cutting through their chatter, instantly silencing them. I've been thinking a lot about Grandma lately, about her promises. My mother waved a dismissive hand. Evelyn loved you, dear, but she was a practical woman. She knew the estate needed a firm hand to manage it. She knew you both very well, and I agreed, letting the statement hang in the air. I reached into my bag and pulled out the small, ornate key from the pottery wheel. I placed it on the center of the table. She left me this. Jessica scoffed. A key, how lovely. What does it open? A music box? In a way, I said. It opened a safe deposit box, and inside I found these. I pulled out the stack of letters from my grandmother, tied with the silk ribbon, and placed them next to the key. My mother's and sister's eyes widened. They recognized the handwriting. A flicker of uncertainty, the first I had seen in 2 months, crossed Jessica's face. What is that? She asked, her voice sharp. It's a story, I said calmly. A story about a woman who was deeply disappointed, who saw the greed growing in her family and decided to conduct one final test of character. As I spoke, the doorbell rang on cue. My mother started to get up, but I held up a hand. Don't worry, I'm expecting him. A moment later, Mr. Harrison walked into the dining room, a leather briefcase in his hand. My mother and Jessica stared at him, their faces a mixture of confusion and alarm. Mr. Harrison, my mother said, her voice tight. What is the meaning of this? Susan, Jessica, he said, his tone formal and resolute. He walked to the head of the table and opened his briefcase. He took out a single document. I'm here tonight in my official capacity as executor of Evelyn Reed's estate. The 60-day period stipulated in her will's codicil has now expired. Codicil? Jessica repeated, her voice shaking slightly. What codicil? This was my moment. I looked from my sister's panicked face to my mother's stunned one. I slowly pushed the document Mr. Harrison had given me to read across the polished table until it stopped right in front of them. It was the final clause. Grandma called it her honesty test. I explained, my voice cold and clear as glass. She left you everything, Jessica, on one condition, that you had the moral character to share it. You had 60 days to do the right thing. You failed. They both lunged for the paper, their hands trembling as they scanned the legal text. I watched as the color drained from their faces. I saw the exact moment the words registered, the moment the catastrophic reality of their situation crashed down on them. The realization that their multi-million-dollar inheritance had just vanished into thin air. They didn't just freeze, it was more than that. It was like watching two statues being carved from ice, their expressions of triumph and arrogance cracking and crumbling away to reveal nothing but hollow, gaping shock beneath. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the steady, rhythmic ticking of the clock, counting down the seconds of their spectacular fall from grace. The silence that followed was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It stretched for what felt like an eternity, thick with the weight of shattered arrogance. Jessica's face was ashen, her mouth slightly agape as she stared at the document, her eyes reading the words over and over as if hoping they would change. My mother just stared into the middle distance, her carefully constructed composure utterly demolished. It was Jessica who broke first. She let out a sound that was halfway between a gasp and a sob. No, she whispered, shaking her head. No, this can't be real. It's a trick. Willow, what did you do? She turned on me, her eyes wild with accusation. You manipulated him. You forged this. It is very real, I assure you, Mr. Harrison said, his voice leaving no room for argument. The document is ironclad, notarized, and has been on file with my office since before your grandmother's passing. It is my legal and fiduciary duty to execute it. As of this moment, the estate of Evelyn Reed is to be entirely liquidated, and its proceeds transferred to the designated charities. My mother finally snapped out of her trance. Charity. She shrieked, her voice shrill. Everything. The house, the money, the jewelry I'm wearing, it's all going to strangers, precisely. Mr. Harrison confirmed. Your daughter was given a choice, Susan. Your family was given a test. You have provided a very clear answer. The rage came next, a tidal wave of it. They screamed, they accused, they threatened lawsuits. They called me a snake, a thief, a monster who had stolen their future. I just sat there, calm and still, letting their venom wash over me without effect. Their words had no power over me anymore. They weren't angry at me. They were angry at the reflection of their own greed, a reflection I had simply held up for them to see. After nearly an hour of their tirade, Mr. Harrison finally had enough. He calmly informed them that he would be in touch with their lawyers and that they would need to vacate the property within 30 days. Then he packed his briefcase, gave me a small, respectful nod, and left. I stood up to leave as well. I hope it was worth it. I said, my voice devoid of emotion. I looked at the lavish dinner getting cold on the table, at the beautiful house that was no longer theirs, at the two women whose lives had just imploded. All of this for nothing. I turned and walked out, leaving them in the ruins of the life they thought they had secured. I didn't look back. The weeks that followed were a quiet revelation. I was free. Free from their judgment, their expectations, their toxic hierarchy. I was no longer the lesser daughter, the disappointing artist. I was just Willow. Mr. Harrison handled the legal fallout, which was considerable but ultimately fruitless for my mother and sister. The story of the Reed inheritance became a piece of whispered gossip in the circles they used to frequent, a cautionary tale about avarice. They lost everything, the money, the status, and the respect they so desperately craved. On my 27th birthday, as my grandmother had planned, the ownership of my studio building was officially transferred to me. With the security she had so cleverly provided, I was able to expand. I bought the flower shop downstairs when the owner retired, and I transformed the space into a beautiful gallery for my work and the work of other local artists. I kept the old pottery wheel, of course. I cleaned and restored it until it hummed back to life, and I placed it in the center of my new, light-filled studio. It wasn't a monument to humiliation anymore. It was a symbol of my grandmother's love and wisdom. It was a reminder that true value isn't in what you own, but in what you create. My relationship with my mother and sister is non-existent now. Their greed cost them an inheritance, but it cost me a family I never truly had in the first place. I don't feel anger anymore, just a quiet sense of peace. I spend my days with my hands in the clay, shaping earth into art, molding my own future. My life isn't flashy or glamorous, but it's mine. It's whole, it's authentic, and it was built not on a broken promise, but on a true and lasting love that found a way to reach me even after death. My grandmother didn't leave me a fortune, she left me a foundation. And from it, I learned how to build a life of my own.